Well, the polls are still open for about an hour and a half longer, but before the results start to come in, we wanted to hear from a local expert on this year's primary.
We'll bring in John Clark, professor of political science at Western Michigan University. Professor Clark, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And first, we want to get to the governor's race, the big race tonight that we're watching, and the Republican primary. Sitting in on the debate this year, I noticed that there's really no friendliness among these candidates. I'm wondering how that may factor in when and if we see a winner tonight, and how that will affect the general election in November.
Well, it is always interesting when we have candidates who are mostly new to politics. They don't have the kinds of relationships with each other that oftentimes we see with candidates who've sort of been in the mix before. And I suspect it's the case that after the primary, after we get a winner, we'll probably see some consolidation of support for that winner from the other candidates. That's typically what we see, and I would certainly expect that to be the case this year as well.
Yeah, and sticking with the GOP race, obviously Trump and his Republican Party, a lot of disputes over the 2020 election results a couple of years ago. What kind of precedents does that set for today's August primary? And do you expect any of these candidates to push back on any of the results that they might not agree with or that don't fall in their favor?
Well, I hope it's the case that most people who are watching the results come in tonight understand after 2020 that just because we get a couple of precincts in, just because we start to see a picture for the entire state, that doesn't mean that all of the ballots have been counted. It certainly could be the case that if the election is in any way close, or if any elections, frankly, today are close, that we might see candidates who protest, who complain, who talk about the fact that somehow something went amiss. But the fact of the matter is we have rules in place. When elections are close, we can have recounts. There are other avenues that candidates can follow. What we saw in 2020 was all of those avenues were followed and it didn't change the results. And I suspect that if there are similar challenges this time, we are again likely to see the results hold because, quite frankly, we've got a pretty good system of elections here in Michigan.
Yeah, and the Secretary of State did come out and say that more than 1 million absentee ballots have been submitted so far, and it may take up to 24 hours to get all of those counted. So that's great, timely insight tonight. Speaking as far as new things are concerned with this election cycle, there's been some redistricting, and there are ballots that some of these voters may see for the very first time with names and races that they haven't seen before. What kind of impact do you think that'll have tonight?
Every 10 years when we have redistricting, it really creates a lot of uncertainty because even incumbent elected officials, in many cases, are now facing different voters. And so it takes time for those voters to learn who the candidates are, to learn a little bit about them. From the candidate's perspective, it creates an awful lot of uncertainty. And I suspect that for a lot of voters, there was uncertainty in this cycle as well, trying to figure out exactly who was going to be on their ballot, but among those candidates that were on their ballot, who they would choose to support.
And then finally, I want to ask, a big topic of conversation, especially for the Republican Party, is the recent overturning of Roe versus Wade. What kind of factor do you think that'll play into tonight's results, especially considering the big news that we had yesterday, Supreme Court ruling that county prosecutors could decide whatever they wanted to pass down to their area before a lawsuit filed by Governor Whitmer?
I don't think it's going to have very much impact at all on today's races. Most all Republicans are opposed to abortion rights. Most all Democrats are in favor of abortion rights. And so there are very few opportunities today for voters to select between pro-choice and pro-life candidates. In the general election, though, it's going to be very different. And so I would expect that the recent Dobbs decision and all that's happening here in Michigan and elsewhere is going to motivate a lot of voters to turn out who might otherwise have sat out the midterm election.
All right, John Clark, thank you so much for joining us. We'll definitely understand a lot more of what we can talk about in an hour and a half when the polls close, but we appreciate you joining us tonight. Thanks.
Hopefully.